Well, can you jump into the beautiful waters of the inner harbor? The question usually that follows that is, yeah, but should you? Right? And for the first 12 years that I've lived in the city of Baltimore, this question of can you jump in the harbor? No, you probably shouldn't. In fact, the only two people I know that ever did, one got tripped by their dog and fell into the water while the dog looked at them like, what happened? And the other was literally trying to save someone's life that had fallen into the water and was drowning. Other than that, I hadn't heard a lot about this. But then this month of June, this beautiful month of June, there are two, albeit very different, notable stories in the news about saying yes to jumping in the harbor. I don't know if you've heard these. The one is the Harbor Splash that's coming up next week, where those who are celebrating and touting the improvement of water quality on the waterfront are going to jump into the harbor as a way to say, yes, let's keep going, let's keep cleaning up the infrastructure, let's keep improving the environment and the water quality of our city, and take the plunge with us and then continue to press on with us. I don't know if you know this, but there's a waiting list to get into that business. The spots for it were gone in 10 minutes. There was a lot of energy around that. So that's kind of cool, right? And then there's this other story that is not rooted in let's get after this, let's do this together. Maybe you've seen this in the Sun or the Banner. Local rapper has decided that he's going to go viral by every day for however many days it takes to go viral is jumping in the water, in the waterfront in creative ways. All in an attempt to promote his rap single. And so if you've followed along on that particular story, it's gaining traction because it's sort of the anti clean water. It's the let's go viral or I'm going to get viral, kind of thing. And I'm not going to try to start a beef here. I don't want to do a Kendrick Drake thing. I think there's probably a better chance that he's going to go viral for jumping in the water amongst those two things. But so two very different approaches to the same thing. Let's jump in the water. Let's get in the water. Let's have some fun. It's summertime. One is rooted in this greater good and this idea of a collective fun way to celebrate what's been accomplished and let's keep going. And the other is kind of essentially a PR campaign to promote a rap single, right? But it expresses attention because it's literally the same thing, jumping in water. Attention is the GOAT Life series. I mean, there's transitions in life that are very common, even if we don't have a lot in common. Buying houses, selling houses, moving into city, moving out of city, changing schools, graduating, trying to figure out meal planning for the week and how we're going to pay for the meal planning in light of the cost of living and all of those things. We have a lot in common in that particular way, but the way in which we do those things, the why behind our what, is often the difference between living well and a life well lived. Right? We can get to the end of our life and have lots of toys and have lots of success and get to the end of it and still say, hey, I don't know if we really lived for the things that mattered. And we get people talking about that in some respective way because of the impact we had on them versus the ability to say, hey, whether they had a lot or a little, whether they were suffering or enjoy, the impact they made on my life was tangible. And most of us on our best days would say, hey, that's the kind of life that we want. Jesus would call that life in John 10:10, life abundantly, that the essence of the Christian message isn't behave yourself, God's watching, but be reconciled to God, because there is a better picture of freedom than one you could purchase or buy or live into with all of your academic pursuits. So we've called this series The GOAT Life. I mean, we've looked at this one particular chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, where the author of Hebrews is highlighting people from Israel's history who have lived into this theme that is connected to the way of Jesus and connecting back to how these particular folks didn't get to see the whole thing in full, but were living into the story that the author is trying to encourage his immediate audience or her immediate audience to celebrate and walk in. Right? So by faith, this is how these people lived. This is what these people chose. may we walk in these same things. So we're looking at some of the characters from Hebrews chapter 11 and connecting it to some themes. Week 1, we talked about the idea of Abraham and his choice for holy curiosity in a time where his choices for contentment and comfort and certainty seem to be more pressing. And then last week we mentioned Moses, then jumped to 1 Timothy 6, but the essence of that message was that Moses, in walking away from the trappings of life in Egypt when he kind of got his, but was watching and witnessing suffering around him, chose generosity, to be rich in the things that matter most, and to walk away from those things and not live in a space of greed and getting his, but like poured himself out. And so we said, hey, what would it look like for us to choose generosity when greed is always kind of lurking around the corner waiting to devour us? We're going to continue today by looking at a third character who, when I just read the one line, won't seem like she has a lot in common with Abraham and Moses. But I'll read the line attributed to her from Hebrews, and then we're going to look at her story and talk a little bit further. Our person today, our person of highlight today is Rahab. Hebrews 11:31 says this, by faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So we got one line attributed to Rahab, and there's a lot said in that line, enough that you would go, if you're unfamiliar with the story, like, time out, can we talk? Can I hear a little bit more before we just jump into like Abraham and Moses and a prostitute named Rahab, and we're just going to press on like it's no big deal? Well, to the author of Hebrews, yeah, because it's a very familiar story to the audience. It's a place where, several places in the New Testament where Rahab is referenced. So let's look at Rahab's story today. Let's choose this theme of selflessness in a time of self-preservation and self-promotion. That's kind of the theme that we're going to look like. We're going to look at the lens of that as we look at Rahab's story today. So Joshua chapter 2 is where we're going to be in our time together. What I'm going to do is kind of work through the story. It's 21 verses here. Try to stick with me. It's all narrative. Hopefully that'll be pretty easy to kind of follow the details of the story. But I'd rather you kind of hear God's word shared than just my interpolation of it. So Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Let me give you a quick backstory, and then we will jump in. Remember, if you were with us in the spring, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt in the themes that we talked about last week briefly. He gets to the cusp of the promised land, does not go in himself, gets a glimpse of it. Joshua is the person appointed to take over and is now sort of doing the work of what does it mean to inhabit the promised land. Okay? So that's where we are. That's where the story finds us. Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So Joshua does this secretly. It is not a secret to the king of Jericho. He knows this is happening. He's got the intel to make this flag. And here the spies are hanging out in a brothel, presumably for business purposes, in the sense of kind of getting the lay of the land. It's possible that this is an inn that doubles as that kind of thing. We'll get more to that in a few minutes. But that's why they're there. They're there for intel. The king knows this is what the king does. The king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they've come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. So the king figures out they're coming, they're here. They go to Rahab's brothel and basically say, hey, we know that there have been reports that these guys are here. And she tells them, no, they're not here. You must have just missed them. They were here, now they're gone. And you got to catch this detail. What did they do? They listened to her. And a core part of the story is, why would they listen to her? Are they just inept government officials that are just, like, oh, they're duped? Or is it possible that Rahab has some savvy and some credibility amongst them that she leverages here to deflect them in another direction? More on that in a few minutes. Verse 8. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and a great fear of you has fallen on us. So all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God in heaven, and the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell us what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. Now the men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you've brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all of your family into your house. If any of them go outside or your house or into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear. Agreed, she replied, let it be as you say. So, as you know, like the siege weeks later will come to the city. The things that have been talked about that are happening in Jericho happen in Jericho. Check out chapter 6, verse 25, and where it comes to fruition and what is said. Chapter 6, verse 25. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men. Joshua had sent spies to Jericho, and she lived among the Israelites to this day. All right, so this is interesting, right? Particularly because I've given you the frame that the way we're going to look at Rahab is as a person who chooses selflessness over self-promotion and self-preservation as a gateway to the goat life. Because isn't there a sense in which what Rahab does is rooted in self-promotion and self-preservation? She saves the life. She saves the life of her family. She doesn't pay a lot of attention to anything else happening there. Okay. The author of Hebrews, though, is pointing to her actions rooted in selflessness as an action that reflects a greater faith she has in the story of God. And so what I want to do over these next few minutes is try to make sense of that. Because I don't think a lot of us would struggle with the idea presented from the pulpit that selflessness over self-preservation and self-promotion is a better way. But what I think Rahab does for us well is talk about how it's complicated and where it's complicated and sort of the decision-making that sometimes feels a little bit weird and how is this not situational ethics and all of these respective questions, okay? I think the thing that we would start with in this conversation is the idea that on some level, this conversation about selflessness connects back to the object of Rahab's trust. So let's start with what she's called. What is she called? Rahab the prostitute. She's called that in Hebrews, she's called that in James, she's called that all but one other place. We'll get to that in a few minutes, right? There's a couple layers by which we might think about Rahab. One is that she is an exploited person who is trapped in the throes of sex work. Right? That's a thing that we talk a lot about today, actually. When we talk about modern pictures of justice, that's a conversation we've had. Another theory is that perhaps she is running the brothel and she's got like a nice little life carved out for herself. Another theory, particularly with her home being on the city wall. Another theory is that she's a shrine prostitute. People that advocate for that would be pointing to the archaeology around the city and also studying ancient cultures, and one of the ways in which gods and goddesses were sort of worshipped and shown grace and favor was through temple prostitution, which in that case would maybe point to the idea of like her vocation and her role being tied to like the identity and the flourishing of the city. Whichever of those three things it is, what do we know? That when the government shows up at her door and says, we know you've got some people in there that we want, and she says they're not here, they go. And what I would offer to you for your consideration is that it probably reflects her standing and the level of relational equity that she's putting on the line in covering things up. To say they're not here and to trust in this thing that she's heard about, more on that in a few minutes, this thing that's happening that she's decided she wants to be a part of. I mean, there is a sense in which if she is a sex worker who's being exploited, that breaking the bondage of like what's happening in Jericho is a thing that's going to set her free. And so she wants to be on board with that. But there's another sense in which all of the relational equity that she's cashing in here that's going to cost her her life is a thing that points us to the real essence of selflessness, which is to say, when the storms of life come, and they will come for you in unexpected moments, perhaps as they are for Rahab, you will meet the things you actually trust in. Not the things you say you trust in, not the things you say you value, but like functionally, when your life is on the line or your livelihood is on the line, what is it that you will say, hey, this is what my hope is in? And what Rahab is commended for by the New Testament authors, by the author of Hebrews, is on some level saying, I want to be part of that story. I want to participate in that, like this whole like thing that's happening here. I'm willing to put all of it on the line for the sake of what's coming. Paul would say it this way in the New Testament, that he would say all these things that he used to identify himself as, that like he put pride in, are a loss compared to knowing Christ and the power of the gospel. Right? And this is the lineage by which Rahab is attaching herself to put that cord in the window, to wait well, is to say, this is the new object of my trust. Not all of these other ways that I've sort of found a way to survive or thrive in this other place. I'm going to find a way to identify myself. Which points to the second idea, that selflessness is always this tension between the greater good and your status quo. How many of us know that there's plenty of things, whether it's a justice issue or just a practical life issue, the tension between actually doing the right thing, whatever we deem it to be, and like the practical steps required to get there, right? Like you might want to eliminate plastic water bottles from your life. And then you will constantly be like, oh, crud, I didn't bring my 10-gallon metallic jug of water to this location. Okay, I'm going to take a plastic water bottle, right? Like the tension between, like one of the big conversations about something like cleaning up the water is that tension between the steps and the cost and the actions you have to take to do that versus the practical tensions of like, yeah, but we have to eat and we have to do these other things and we have other things to deal with in our city, right? There's always a tension between the status quo and like that greater life and that greater story. And when the status quo is threatened, and this is part of what we see in verse 8, fear sets in. So you hear Rahab tell these spies, everyone here is like scared to death in light of what we're hearing about you. Verse 11 talks about this idea. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God of heaven above and on earth below. That essentially, in what Rahab is wrestling with, is like, hey, there's a narrative that's defined Jericho up to this point. There's a habit, there's a rhythm to life, there's what thriving and surviving look. There's a status quo. And up to this point, whether she's thriving as a business owner or as surviving as an exploited person, there's a way in which she's surviving. And yet, as she's watching and listening to how people are responding in fear, she says, I'm going to embrace this story. I'm going to embrace what I'm hearing about this God versus the fear and the panic that I'm seeing in other people. You may not be able to feel her tension profession for profession. But in your time, have you known anybody in light of an undercurrent of fear of losing their status quo, panic and do really crazy things in the name of fear? Embrace weird ideologies or conspiracies? Embrace people that you're surprised to find them putting trust in, do things that are out of character? Why? Because they're scared, and they're scared of losing the status quo. And on some level, the selflessness of Rahab models a willingness to trust this greater story than to hold on, gripping to, whether it's surviving or thriving, the status quo that she features. And that's an essence of the goat life, right? What does it mean to live into the greatest story, even if it disrupts my status quo? If it disrupts all of the trappings of the good life that I've built for myself up to this point? I think we can take this a step further for Rahab in particular, which I'll get to in just a minute. I want to say one other thing. The interesting thing about Rahab here, and I think this ties to self-preservation well, you know, a difficult thing to do in our time? I mean, Rahab, we're not told has a, you know, the other two people I've talked about in this series so far have some sort of encounter with God. Go to this land and do this thing. Moses, there's a bush talking to me. All right, I'm going to do what that says. We're not told Rahab has either of those things. What we're told Rahab has is the stories she hears as a participant in a brothel on the city wall. And there's some level to which we can look at Rahab's wrestling. I imagine some very imperfect vessels have told her these stories. Right? I imagine some unsavory and untrustworthy people have made mention. And to try and distinguish what is fear-mongering and what is truth, to try and distinguish who God is in light of what God in their city looks like, I think it's commendable, first of all, not only to think about Rahab's willingness to selflessly engage those questions and follow the truth wherever it leads and deconstruct and reconstruct, but also to just think practically about the power of sharing our faith today, the tensions of sharing our faith and our story, right? How many of us know just the realities of, like, it's really weird, and you will find yourself immediately in self-preservation or self-promotion to sort of figure out, how do I talk about faith in Jesus in 2024 Baltimore, where there's a cultural churchianity that doesn't always look like Jesus, where there is church hurt, where there is imperfect vessels having shared this story at another time, and then wondering aloud, like, does my story and my testimony matter at all? And I wonder if there's not something for us there in Rahab's selflessness. To remember that the reason why Rahab hears and embraces this story is because someone else is telling it. And if we talk about selflessness versus self-preservation as a community, I'm not talking about finding someone today on your walk to the Orioles game and going, if you died tonight, where would you go? Don't do that. But to be earnestly looking for opportunities to share the power of God working in our story and to share God's character even when shrinking back or figuring out how to walk the tensions of that. I'm not saying is simple and easy, but I wonder if it's not worth mentioning as part of Rahab's story that that's how she connected to the story. And that testimony is part of what lives into that. So living in the tyranny of the urgent, where there's always something calling us back to self-preservation. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll get to the thing. Do you know how many other things I have to do today? There's another piece I want to highlight from Rahab. I was starting to get there. Joshua 6:25 tells us that when the Israelites come and they take over Jericho, Rahab doesn't go get a house 40 minutes outside the city. She stays there and she lives in the tension of assimilating herself into the Israelite culture. I imagine, as air quote, Rahab the prostitute, that has some tense days. It has some weird moments where she's lauded as a hero and probably doesn't want the attention. It probably has some weird side-eye when people find out. There's some level of walking in the tension of what you've done versus what you're doing. So every other time in Scripture, save for one, she's listed as Rahab the prostitute, actually connecting back to this story, not from a place of shame. But in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, she's listed differently. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. Lest you think this is just another boring genealogy from the Bible, this is the genealogy of Jesus. Why does this matter? Because people like Rahab get omitted from those kinds of genealogies. There's something she lives into. This isn't to say, I thought when I read another sermon from a friend recently, I was recalled, this isn't saying, well, motherhood saved her. It's not saying that. But it's saying there's a way she figured out how to live into a new identity that changed the narrative. Not just the narrative given to her, but on some level, the narrative that she's absorbed about her story. So whatever got her to the place where that was her job, that was her vocation, to move to a place where by Matthew chapter 1, she's being identified in the lineage of Jesus, proudly highlighted as a reflection of the kind of character and characters that God is drawing in. I wonder aloud if maybe selflessness over self-preservation is not also the consideration of moving past our self-consciousness and self-obsession. The constant worrying about whether or not we measure up and whether or not we're okay. You remember that moment when you were in middle school or high school where you're just convinced that everyone in the room is talking about you. But there's a sense in which, and I think I'll connect this to Father's Day because I think it's part of what makes Father's Day complicated for some of us. Is like the voice of the people who shape whether or not we are in good standing. And those voices living in our heads sometimes go down generational lines. And we find ourselves being busy with things that if we peel back the layers of why, we're always trying to outrun that voice that says you're not blank enough. Or you always do this and you never did that and you never blah, 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 whatever it is. And I think Rahab shows us that selflessness in part it's not just being busy serving people, but that Joshua 6:25 moment connected to Matthew 1 shows us the narrative to stay at the table, to let the Lord work and move in our story, so that this isn't just a testimony of a one-off act of a kind, self-preservative. That's why the authors of Hebrews, I think, call back to it. Because her story is so much more than this person that did this one nice thing. She has none of the trappings of she's not Jewish. She's a woman. She's a sex worker. and she's being highlighted in Matthew chapter 1. We have to ask ourselves why. And I think that's worth mentioning. James chapter 2 talks about one more particular thing I want to highlight about selflessness. Selflessness choosing more than just talk. More than just right beliefs, but right action, right? It's important for us to highlight and know that Rahab's not mentioned here because she has a perfect sexual ethic and a perfect theology of sex and love. James chapter 2, verse 25 says this, "In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." And so the call to selflessness here is a call, again, to come back to, and this original thing you might know about Rahab, was that her act of faith was taking these concepts she was hearing about in some way and actually putting them into practice. That it was not just being the smartest person at the coffee shop. It wasn't just being the person that was well-versed in all matters of faith and belief. But it was people who were willing to take those things and apply them to the messy situations in our story. And so as we think about the people that have often made the most difference to us, it's probably the people that didn't just talk about all the great things that you're supposed to do and all the great things you're supposed to believe, but the people that showed us with their actions what the goat life really looks like. And she's mentioned amongst those. So in that same way, I want to close by inviting us to think about the aspects of her story, right? As we consider selflessness, let us consider the object of our trust. Let us consider our status quo and like why we are so busy spinning our wheels. What it is we're actually trusting in. And may we be a people like Rahab who take the things we're hearing about God and the way to the life that is truly life and find space this week to actually put them into practice, to actually live them out. Not just as aspirational things, but as the type of things where we would just say, hey, we're being faithful. But it was making a difference in someone else's story. We'll go back to where we started, and we'll move to communion. The very first thing Julia led us in this morning was this moment from Mark chapter 10, where Jesus is listening to disciples like jockey for position amongst them. And I wonder, you may feel like you would not be so presumptuous, but I think a lot of us know the tension of, hey, I'm hopeful that Jesus is just kind of a gateway drug to my best life. And if I could co-opt Jesus for a life well lived and some good morals and my kids to behave themselves and maybe be quiet at the dinner table and go to bed on time and whatever else whatever else I'm bargaining for today, okay, if Jesus is the gateway to that, I'll take it. And Jesus says, you don't understand. Because that's not what this is about. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Communion shows us that we don't serve a God who's like sitting up going, yeah, did you get it right this week? How did you do? Like other voices that are in our head, but stepped into our midst, poured out on our behalf, is inviting us to receive that that's where life is found, and is inviting us to walk in that, in how we love and care for the people that are important to us and the people we don't like so much. When we come to the Lord's table, it's a chance to let our lives be disrupted and disoriented in a good way. That a lot of the voices we're chasing do not offer the life they promise. And that this upside-down kingdom is the one in which real freedom in life is found. So communion this morning, as we go to these tables or stations and we take of bread and cup and take it back to our seat, we're not engaging in checkbox religious activity. We're really asking the Lord to help us receive it with fresh eyes, fresh hearts, and fresh hands. Let me pray for us, and then we'll go to the tables and receive together. God, there are so many ways in an era of self-promotion and self-preservation, we do the jumping into the harbors. Lord, we come to this moment to just peel back the layers of our story, to look at our why. God, your why, in your vastness and your wisdom, it's so scandalous that you love us, that you would extend grace to us, that we're not worthy of it, but we can receive it. That's such a different voice than the voice a lot of us are walking in. And then that there's a better way than just amassing stuff for ourselves. Lord, as we come to this reminder of how you have shown your character to be, help us to really receive the beauty of your kingdom. And give us the courage to walk in it. In the name of Jesus, amen.